The intrinsic value of human life may be the most fundamental moral principle that's held by Western society at large. Ending human life is almost always seen as unacceptable. The sole exception is protection from harm, though it takes many forms. For example, personal defense, war, capital punishment, and even abortion. The more remote and less serious the danger to others, the less people tend to accept it as a justification for killing. An overwhelming majority of people support the moral option to kill someone who's directly threatening to harm innocent people. Many people, but not all, allow soldiers the moral option to kill others in order to safeguard against potential harm to the citizens of their country and their way of life. A fair amount would support the use of capital punishment in order to potentially deter hypothetical future murders. And abortion is hugely controversial as it largely threatens the way in which someone would like to live their life, but the risk to their life is quite minimal. Personal freedom to make decisions for oneself is very often said to extend to the exact point where the freedom of others would be infringed upon. When it comes to the freedom to kill, proper justification must show that not killing would lead to a larger infringement on freedom than the killing itself. This logic is quite pertinent to the discussion of the morality of suicide and euthanasia. If people should have the freedom to choose to do with their body what they wish, as long as it doesn't harm others, intuitively, they should be allowed to choose to end their own life. Now, many people would argue that they should only have this right if the suffering that is driving their wish to die isn't likely to end, as allowing them to do so earlier enables suicide by people who merely can't see their situation as short-term. This assumes that if they could see this reality, they would choose not to commit suicide, and so this doesn't violate their autonomy. This deals with the principle of a settled preference, meaning that the preference to commit suicide is not settled in that it's very likely that given time and energy expended to solve the problem, their preference would change. Now, if accepted, this view would not allow morally justified suicide from people, except the chronically and terminally ill, as their suffering can't be alleviated and has very little to no potential to disappear. This brings us to different categories of suicide, of euthanasia, both of active and passive varieties. Active euthanasia is the active killing or medical treatment to someone that will end their life, while passive euthanasia is merely refraining from medical treatment that will prolong their life and allowing natural causes to take over. To many philosophers on euthanasia and medically assisted suicide, the difference between passive and active euthanasia is quite significant. Next, we'll take a look at some of the arguments against medically assisted suicide. Now, Daniel Callahan responds to the justification of medically assisted suicide on the grounds of personal freedom or autonomy. He contends that this act is not a private act by nature of involvement of the medical profession. He also believes that the act legitimizes the option of suicide and promotes it among the general population as something that is generally justifiable, which he sees as a bad thing. He also believes that by the nature of the medical profession, the regulation and oversight that would be needed to limit abuse of the medically assisted suicide system would be very hard to implement, and we'll get to that point. Callahan also believes that there are very few accepted societal reasons for killing, and as a trend, we've been decreasing the number of them. He believes that we shouldn't add one without extreme careful consideration. However, some contend that if that's the case, and we're not considering each justification on a case-by-case basis, but just as a rule of limiting the amount of justifications for killing, that other morally accepted justifications of killing could be removed as well, such as self-defense. Now, next, we'll talk about the nature of the medical profession and how doctors can or should be involved in euthanasia. One significant point of contention in this debate is on the moral difference, or lack thereof, of ceasing treatment that will stave off death versus speeding up an inevitable death through the use of medicine. In other words, passive versus active euthanasia. James Rachels doesn't believe there's a moral difference between these two, and argues that the justification of passive euthanasia also justifies active euthanasia, as the justification of passive euthanasia is to minimize suffering of another person by changing medical treatment that will cause their death to come sooner. Similarly, active euthanasia will often result in a quicker death and thus less suffering than its passive counterpart, and so is just as morally justifiable. And he also believes that under the American Medical Association's policy of allowing passive euthanasia but not active euthanasia, irrelevant factors come to determine decisions. Most notably that whether or not the person will die soon of natural causes becomes extremely important, even though more significant is the person's willingness to die and their suffering and how easily it is to be fixed. Now, in response to this, Philippa Foot argues that one can't originate a fatal sequence of events, although they can allow one to run its course naturally. In a thought experiment to illustrate this point, Philippa puts you in the driver's seat of a car driving to save 5 people from an incoming ocean tide. Now, you learn that there is one other person in a different area who will also die if you don't save them. Now, they argue that it's okay to let this one person die in order to save the 5. But if this one person was totally safe on the road between you and the other 5 people, and the only way that you can save the 5 is by running them over, it would not be morally justifiable to do so, as that would be killing as opposed to allowing to die. And finally, even if one does accept the moral justification of physician-assisted suicide, an important note is the implementation and oversight using legal guidelines. Now, Gerald Dworkin asserts that a possible reason to refuse making active euthanasia legal is to avoid an inevitable possibility of medical professional abuse and error, especially considering with medical privacy rights that oversight would be quite difficult. But in response, Michael Irwin explains how in Oregon, where active euthanasia has been made legal, it hasn't radically altered the medical profession or shown signs of abuse. In fact, that it hasn't been particularly significantly popular, and that many who applied for it ended up deciding not to go through with it. He argues that if it continues to be successful in Oregon, it should be implemented more widely. At times, deeply held moral principles face off, and solutions often must prioritize them. The question of suicide, especially in response to painful and life-ending illness, pits personal autonomy and the value of human life against each other. As a society, we have to decide how far these principles extend. Some of the most common arguments on each side have been presented. I hope this speech has made the intricacies of this important question a little bit clearer.